Hello, welcome back to the recordings of the specific fallacies, and we'll focus on the violations of the argument scheme rule now. Now, this argument scheme rule is rule 8 of the rules for critical discussion. Here you see it. And it lays down that a standpoint may not be regarded as conclusively defended if the defense does not take place by means of an appropriate argument scheme that is correctly applied. So just to refresh your memory, an argument scheme denotes the relation between the standpoint and the arguments. So we've already discussed this, but you have three main types. An argument scheme could be causal, it could be analogical, or it could be symptomatic. And each of these types also has subtypes. So symptomatic argumentation has, for instance, as a subtype, authority argumentation. So you could go wrong with argument schemes in two ways. Either you use them inappropriately or incorrectly. And an example of an inappropriate argument scheme is the following. So here you see that the discussant argues that The Handmaid's Tale is the best series ever, and he or she does so because everybody, based on the argument that everybody says so. And now, of course, you might be a bit critical about this argumentation because people are sometimes, or maybe often, mistaken. So the fact that everybody says so doesn't really mean that The Handmaid's Tale really is the best series ever. So this appeal to popular opinion is called a fallacy ad populum, or an ad populum fallacy, an argumentum ad populum. And this, Van Emelen and Snoek-Henkemans, the authors of our textbook, they say this is always inappropriate, so you should never use this argument scheme. Now, there's also examples of incorrectly applied argument schemes, and one is presented here. So you have a grandmother who talks to her grandchild, and she says, "You can't move out when you're only 18. I lived at my parents' till I got married." Now here, probably the grandchild would not really accept the standpoint because, times differ, and probably the way in which the grandmother grew up and the conventions and traditions at that time are strikingly different from what the grandchild is used to. So here we could argue that the grandmother commits a fallacy of false analogy. Now here you can see it's a matter of degree, because if you would have this argument, so you can't move out when you're only 18 because your sister wasn't allowed either, it might be more comparable. It of course depends on the context. Maybe the sister and the person referred to differ very widely in age. That could be the case, or they're very different kind of situations in which they live. But let's assume that they're more similar. Then here, if they're really similar, I would argue that this is sound use of analogy argumentation, while before we've seen that there was a false analogy with the grandmother, so that will be fallacious use of the argumentation here. Now, another example, just to cover all the three main types of argument schemes. Here we have an argument for the following standpoint. Dutch high schools don't care about their pupils. I know of a pupil who dropped out and the school only noticed after a year. Now, if someone argues this is quite questionable if a school only notices this after a year. But anyway, you could also criticize the argumentation here, so not just the behavior of the school, but really the argumentation, because it might be a bit, it might go a bit too far to say that all Dutch high schools don't care about their pupils. Maybe this is a one-off, because we just have one example. So this is actually called a hasty generalization, or a secundum quid fallacy. And it's an incorrect use of symptomatic argumentation, because the school that the person knew, that's just a sign, like an example of the acceptability of the standpoint. Now, here again, it's a matter of degree, and you could think of maybe a sound counterpart of this argument. I was thinking of something like referring to 1,000 pupils or more who have the same experience, then you could argue that would be a sound use of symptomatic argumentation, whereas the previous instantiation with just the n is 1, n equals 1 example, fallacious use. So what we've seen is that you can use inappropriate argument schemes, and the example that we discussed is the ad populum, but you could also use an argumentum ad consequentiam. And I haven't discussed it now, but I discussed it in the general introduction clip. But anyway, the ad consequentiam, I gave the example of chocolate and that it cannot be unhealthy because it tastes too good. But then, this doesn't make sense because there are many unhealthy things that taste good. And so here you have a factual standpoint, a factual claim in the standpoint, it cannot be unhealthy. And it's supported by an evaluative claim. And in the textbook, it is discussed that these schemes, using a factual claim supported by an evaluative claim, they always result in an ad consequentiam fallacy, so they're always inappropriate. And then we have the incorrectly applied argument schemes, so the hasty generalization that we've seen, as well as the fallacy of false analogy. But there are also ad verecundiam fallacies, the post hoc ergo propter hoc, nicest name of a fallacy, and the slippery slope fallacy. So just a quick explanation here. The ad verecundiam we've seen because it's also a violation of Rule 4 that has the same name, but this is a different variant. So in violating Rule 4, there's ethos that replaces logos. That's called an ethical fallacy, but is also referred to as an ad verecundiam. But here we have another ad verecundiam. It's an incorrect use of authority argumentation. So I could, for example, have an authority argument that's perfectly fine. Something like, this is a fallacy because Van Emeren, the author of this book on argumentation, says it's a fallacy. And then, this is kind of a credible authority, so yes, let's accept his authority in this argument. But we could also have, I think you have diabetes because Van Emeren says so. Now, this Van Emeren, he's a specialist on argumentation theory, but not really on medical diagnoses. So here we have an instance of incorrectly applied authority argumentation, in other words, of an argumentum ad verecundiam. On to the post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is the fallacy that translates literally to after this, because of this. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. And it's usually illustrated with the following. You have a rooster who crows, and then after that, the sun rises. Is that sunrise or sunset? Anyway, the sun goes up. The sun goes up. So you can conclude from that crowing of a rooster causes the sun to come up. Now that, of course, is ridiculous, but it shows why this fallacy goes wrong, because it's an incorrect use of causal argumentation. There's a correlation, but it's confused with a causation. With the slippery slope, our last example here, you say something goes from bad to worse. So you argue, for instance, that we shouldn't have only online courses because if we do, then in the end we won't see anyone anymore, and if we won't see anyone anymore, then we'll all get depressed, and if we all get depressed, then people won't work, and if we won't work, then the economy falls down, and if the economy falls down, well, it goes on and on, but it's going downhill, so and down a slippery hill, so to say. So that's our slippery slope fallacy. In this case, also an incorrect use of specifically pragmatic argumentation. So, loads of examples. One more to show you that in real life, fallacies that are violations of the argument scheme rule are committed to. And here we have a tweet by Donald Trump, and he says, "In the East, it could be the coldest New Year's Eve on record. Perhaps we could use a little bit of the good old global warming that our country, but not other countries, was going to pay trillions of dollars to protect against. Bundle up. So here we have, well, a sort of hasty generalization, right? So global warming doesn't seem to exist because we have the coldest New Year's Eve on record. That's the underlying reasoning. But actually, of course, cold New Year's Eves or other time periods that are really cold are just a side effect of global warming. So it's a bit of a strange argument here. So I'll leave you with this to think about. And there are 2 more recordings that you might watch, Rule 9 and 10. And thanks now for your attention. Keep me posted.